David had just moved into his new home, eager to leave behind the hustle and bustle of city life. His new house was a spacious, two-story home on a quiet cul-de-sac, nestled in a peaceful neighborhood by the lake. The kind of place where he could finally relax, enjoy his mornings with a cup of coffee, and not be bothered by the noise of traffic or the stress of work. The house itself was perfect, with a large yard, tall trees surrounding it, and a big garage where he could park his car. It was everything he had dreamed of, a fresh start, away from the chaos of his previous life. When he first arrived, David couldn't help but admire the neighborhood's calm atmosphere. The streets were lined with beautiful houses, each one well-kept and neatly manicured. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed friendly, and life moved at a slower, more relaxed pace. The air smelled fresh, and the sound of birds chirping in the morning added to the tranquility. But something wasn't quite right. David first noticed it when he was unpacking boxes one afternoon. As he was carrying a heavy box of books into the house, he felt a pair of eyes on him. He turned around, expecting to see a neighbor, but no one was there. Then, a few moments later, he saw her, Karen. She was standing in her yard across the street, watching him. At first, David thought it was just a coincidence, but as days went by, he began to realize that Karen was always around when he was doing something. Whether it was mowing the lawn, moving furniture, or taking out the trash, Karen was always there, observing him from her yard or from her window. It wasn't a casual glance. It felt more like she was making sure everything was being done properly. The idea that his every move was being watched was unsettling, but David didn't want to make a fuss. He figured maybe she was just a neighbor who liked to keep an eye on things. But as time passed, Karen's presence became more apparent. One day, when David was trimming the bushes near the driveway, Karen appeared in her front yard. She was holding a clipboard and had a somewhat stern expression on her face. "Hi, David," she said in a cheery but almost too formal voice. "I'm Karen. I live across the street. I just wanted to introduce myself and also remind you that there are some neighborhood rules to follow. The HOA keeps track of these things to make sure everything is up to standard." David was taken aback. He had heard of the Homeowners Association, but he hadn't realized how closely they monitored the neighborhood. He nodded politely, trying to mask his discomfort. "Sure, I'll keep that in mind. Thanks for letting me know." Karen smiled tightly, as if she was pleased with his response. "No problem. Just make sure your lawn is always trimmed and that your trash bins are put away before sunset. We wouldn't want any complaints from the HOA." She paused and added, "If you need anything, feel free to come by." David didn't know what to make of this conversation. He had always been careful about keeping his property in good shape, but Karen's words made him feel like he was being scrutinized. He didn't think much of it at first, but soon enough, Karen's presence became more invasive. Over the next few days, Karen would come outside every time David did something in his yard, always just far enough away to seem casual but close enough to watch him. David would wave, and she would nod, but there was always something unnerving about her behavior. It was as if she was waiting for him to make a mistake. One morning, David decided to go for a walk around the block to clear his mind. He had been feeling a little more tense than usual lately, and he needed a break from unpacking. As he strolled down the street, he saw Karen again, standing in her yard, staring at him with an almost too keen gaze. He forced a smile and waved, but Karen didn't wave back. Instead, she gave him a long look before turning and disappearing into her house. Something wasn't right. David felt it in his gut. Karen wasn't just a curious neighbor. She was someone who needed control. It wasn't just about the rules. It was about power. And as the days went by, David couldn't shake the feeling that his peaceful new life was under some kind of quiet surveillance. One evening, as he was finishing up in the garage, David noticed Karen again. This time, she wasn't standing in her yard. She was standing just inside her front door, peering out at him through the window. He could see her silhouette, her eyes fixed on him, watching his every move. David tried to ignore it, but it was hard. His new life, which had started with such excitement and hope, was now starting to feel suffocating. It was as if he had unknowingly stepped into a trap, and Karen held the strings. What had seemed like a perfect neighborhood was quickly turning into a place where David was no longer free to live on his own terms. David didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. His quiet neighborhood was about to be shaken up in ways he hadn't anticipated. And Karen, from the HOA, was going to be at the center of it all. The next few days were uncomfortable for David. The idea that Karen from the HOA was watching him every time he stepped outside started to feel like more than just coincidence. He tried to push it out of his mind, but it was hard not to notice her presence, always lurking in the background, her eyes seemingly fixed on him from her window or front yard. One afternoon, David was in the driveway, unpacking boxes from his car. The sun was setting, and he had a lot to do before the day ended. He was trying to get everything settled so he could finally enjoy his new home. As he lifted another box, he glanced across the street and saw Karen standing on her porch, staring at him. He gave a polite wave, but she didn't wave back. She just stood there, watching him with a small, almost amused smile on her face. David tried to focus on his work, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for him to do something wrong. It was a strange feeling. He'd never had a neighbor be so fixated on him before. The idea that she was judging every little thing he did made him feel like he was constantly under a microscope. The next day, David was in the backyard, mowing the lawn. As usual, Karen appeared in her front yard, though this time she didn't seem to be doing anything in particular. She simply stood there, watching him from across the street. Her eyes followed his every movement as he worked. When David glanced up for a second, he saw her quickly look away, as though she had been caught staring. But it wasn't enough to make her stop. Soon enough, she was back to watching him again. That afternoon, David decided to confront her. He had had enough of feeling like he was being monitored. It wasn't healthy, and it wasn't fair. He needed to set some boundaries. He walked across the street to Karen's house, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He knocked on her door, and after a few moments, Karen appeared. She greeted him with a smile that felt a little too wide. "Hi, David. What can I do for you?" she asked, her voice sweet but with an edge he couldn't ignore. "Hi, Karen," David said, trying to keep his tone friendly. "I've noticed that, well, you've been watching me a lot. Every time I go outside, it seems like you're there, just looking at what I'm doing." Karen's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, I'm just making sure everything's going well. You know, the HOA likes to keep things neat around here. We have to keep up the standard, or things can get a little out of hand." She smiled again, almost like she was making an excuse, but there was a definite hint of control in her words. David felt a little uneasy. "I understand, but it's starting to feel like you're spying on me. I'm just trying to settle in and get things done around here. I don't need anyone watching me all the time." Karen stepped back slightly, as if surprised by his words. "Oh, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I'm just doing my job," she said with a calm, measured voice. "The HOA expects all of us to follow the rules. It's my duty to make sure we all stay on track. You wouldn't want any complaints, would you?" David clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. "I don't need anyone checking up on me. I'm perfectly capable of managing my property. If I need anything, I'll reach out. But I would appreciate it if you didn't keep such a close eye on me." Karen's smile faded, and for a brief moment, her expression hardened. "Of course, David. I'll keep that in mind," she said, but there was a coldness in her voice now. David turned to leave, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the end of it. Karen might have agreed to back off for now, but something told him that she wouldn't let him go so easily. It wasn't just about following the rules anymore. It was about control. And David knew that as long as he lived in this neighborhood, Karen would find ways to keep him under her watchful eye. Over the next few days, Karen kept her distance, at least outwardly. David started to relax a little, thinking that maybe things had cooled down. But as he moved forward with unpacking and settling into his new life, a part of him couldn't shake the sense that this was just the calm before the storm. Karen hadn't given up yet, and sooner or later, he knew she would make her move again. As David went to bed that night, The last thought on his mind was Karen. He hoped that he had done the right thing by confronting her. But deep down, he had a feeling that the peaceful life he had hoped for was slipping further out of reach. The quiet neighborhood he had moved to was about to get a whole lot more complicated. And David wasn't sure how much longer he could stay under Karen's watchful eye without something giving way. David was starting to think that maybe he had overreacted to Karen's behavior. For a few days, there was peace. He didn't see her watching him as much, and he was beginning to feel like maybe he could start enjoying his new life. But of course, things weren't meant to be that easy. It started when David decided to finally clean out the garage. He'd been putting it off for a while because it seemed like such a big task, but it was time. His garage had become a storage space for boxes, tools, and the last few odds and ends from his move. The sun was out, the weather was perfect, and it felt like the right time to get everything organized. David opened the garage door and started moving things around. As he worked, he caught a glimpse of a car parked in front of his neighbor Karen's house. He noticed it immediately because it was new, shiny, and expensive looking. It was a sleek, black luxury car, and it gleamed in the sunlight. It must have been brand new, and David couldn't help but admire it. He didn't know much about cars, but even he could tell that this one was special. David went about his task, not thinking too much about it, when suddenly he heard the sound of Karen's voice. He turned around to see her standing at the end of his driveway, glaring at him. She wasn't smiling this time, and there was a sharp edge to her expression. "Excuse me, David," she said, her voice colder than usual. "What are you doing with my car?" David's heart skipped a beat. "Your car?" he asked, confused. He didn't know what she was talking about. "Yes, my car." Karen snapped. "That black car in the driveway. What are you doing with it? It was just delivered today, and now I see it in your garage." David looked over at the car, then back at her. "I didn't touch your car," he said, trying to remain calm. "I'm just cleaning out my garage. I didn't even know it was yours." Karen's eyes widened with fury. "Don't lie. I just bought that car, and now you're hiding it in your garage. Are you trying to steal it?" David was shocked. "Karen, what are you talking about? I've never even seen your car before today. I'm just organizing my garage." But Karen wasn't listening. She started shouting louder, her voice rising with every word. "You think I don't know what's going on? You think I'm stupid? You've stolen my car. You've stolen it right in front of me." David felt a knot form in his stomach. The situation was escalating too quickly. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could she accuse him of stealing her car without any evidence? What was wrong with her? His peaceful life had suddenly turned into a nightmare, and Karen's accusations were making everything worse. Before David could say anything else, Karen pulled out her phone and, with trembling hands, dialed 911. David stood there, speechless, as Karen screamed into the phone, "Yes, hello. I'm at 1234 Maple Street, and I just caught my neighbor stealing my brand new car. He's hiding it in his garage. Please send someone immediately." David's mind raced. This wasn't happening. Karen was calling the police on him over a misunderstanding that she was completely fabricating. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. How had everything gotten so out of control so fast? A few moments later, David heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. Karen stood there, still talking on the phone, her finger pointing accusingly at David's garage. "He's got my car in there. He's a thief, and he's trying to get away with it." David turned to go inside his house, not knowing what to do. His heart was pounding. How could this be happening? What would the police think? As the sirens grew louder, David realized that things were about to spiral even further out of control. It wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was becoming a full-blown situation, and David had no idea how to stop it. As the sirens grew louder, David's mind raced. He could hear Karen's voice in the distance, still shouting into the phone, accusing him of stealing her car. The tension was thick, and David felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had never imagined that something as simple as cleaning out his garage would turn into a full-blown emergency. The police arrived quickly. Two officers pulled up in their patrol car, and David felt a rush of panic. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but how could he explain this to them when Karen was so insistent? One of the officers, a tall man with short-cropped hair, approached David cautiously. "Sir, we received a report of stolen property," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Can you explain why this car is in your garage?" David opened his mouth to speak, but Karen interrupted him, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. "He's lying," she screamed. "I just bought that car, and he's hiding it in his garage. He's a thief, and he needs to be arrested." David took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "Karen, I don't know what's going on here. I'm just cleaning out my garage. I didn't take your car." The other officer, a woman with a calm demeanor, raised an eyebrow. "Karen, is this the car you're talking about?" she asked, pointing toward the luxury vehicle parked outside. "Yes, that's the one," Karen shouted. "He's been hiding it in his garage, and now he's trying to cover it up. He must have stolen it." David turned to the officer, trying to explain. "I had no idea that car was hers. I've never touched it. I was just getting my own car out of the garage when Karen started accusing me. She even called the police, saying I stole it." The officer with short-cropped hair turned to Karen. We need to be sure about this before we take any further action." He then asked David to step aside and began inspecting the car. David watched anxiously as the officer carefully examined the vehicle. It wasn't long before the officer shook his head. "There's no evidence of any theft here," the officer said, turning back to Karen. "This car belongs to you, but there's no reason to believe it's been stolen." Karen's face turned red with anger. "What do you mean? He's been hiding it in his garage. It's obvious he took it." The officer remained calm. We've checked everything. There's no indication of theft, and no crime has been committed here." David let out a sigh of relief, but Karen wasn't done. "This is ridiculous. He's lying, and you're just letting him get away with it," she shouted, her hands shaking with rage. "He's going to ruin this whole neighborhood with his behavior." The officers exchanged a glance before the female officer turned to Karen. "Karen, we've been here long enough. If you don't have any further evidence, this matter is resolved. Please calm down and go inside." David stood there, watching as Karen huffed and stormed back into her house. The officers turned to him, clearly aware of how strange the situation had been. "Sir," the tall officer said with a slight smile, "we're sorry for the confusion. You're free to go. But if there's anything else, don't hesitate to reach out." David nodded, still in shock. "Thank you, officer. I don't understand what happened here. I never expected something like this." The officer's smile faded slightly. "Some neighbors can be a bit overzealous. Just make sure you document everything. If she keeps causing problems, you may want to contact the HOA or even take legal action." As the police left, David stood there, his mind racing. What had just happened? It wasn't just about the car anymore. Karen had created a scene that would be hard to shake off. He didn't know how much longer he could keep his peace in this neighborhood. Every time he turned around, it seemed like Karen was there, trying to make his life difficult. David didn't know what Karen had planned next, but he was certain that this wouldn't be the last time he'd have to deal with her. The peace he had hoped for when moving into his new home seemed farther away than ever. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much bigger problem. The following days were a blur of confusion and frustration for David. The confrontation with Karen and the police had left him feeling unsettled. He had done nothing wrong, yet he found himself trapped in a web of accusations and misunderstandings. The whole thing had felt like an invasion of his privacy. David just wanted to live his life peacefully, but it seemed like Karen was determined to make that impossible. The situation had taken a toll on him. His new home, which he had imagined would be his sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. He had hoped to escape the chaos of his old life, but instead, he found himself at the center of an ongoing struggle with an overbearing neighbor and the HOA that supported her. David tried to go about his daily routine, but every time he stepped outside, he felt like he was being watched. Karen seemed to be everywhere, lurking in the background, waiting for the next opportunity to accuse him of something else. It was starting to feel like he couldn't win. Then, one afternoon, as David was working in the garage again, he heard a knock at his door. He hesitated for a moment before walking to answer it, wondering who it could be this time. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with Mrs. Green, the president of the HOA. "David, we need to talk," she said, her tone serious. David's heart sank. He had a feeling he knew what this was about. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "We've had a report from Karen," Mrs. Green began. "She says that you've been violating neighborhood rules and causing disturbances. She's not happy with the way you've been behaving, and the HOA is getting complaints." David felt a wave of frustration rise inside him. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to live my life here," he said, his voice tight. "Karen's been making false accusations about me, and I'm getting tired of it." Mrs. Green didn't seem to be moved by his frustration. "David, we have to take these complaints seriously. The HOA has a responsibility to maintain order in the neighborhood. I'm just doing my job." David couldn't believe it. Karen had already tried to destroy his reputation with the police, and now she was using the HOA to further her control over him. He had to put a stop to it. "I'm not breaking any rules," David said, his voice firm. "I'm being harassed by Karen, and it's not right." Mrs. Green paused for a moment, clearly weighing her words. "I understand your frustration, David. But you need to understand that the HOA has a role to play here. We'll be keeping an eye on the situation, and if there are any further complaints, we'll have to take action." David knew this wasn't going to end anytime soon. Karen wasn't just going to let him go, and now the HOA was involved. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the next round of accusations. He had to do something. He had to fight back. As Mrs. Green turned to leave, David made up his mind. This wasn't just about a car or a trash can anymore. This was about standing up for himself and taking control of his life again. He wouldn't let Karen, or the HOA, push him around any longer. David's fight with Karen and the HOA had only just begun, but he was determined to win. The tension between David and Karen seemed to grow by the day. The HOA was now involved, and he knew that every little thing he did was being scrutinized. The accusations, the false reports, and the constant feeling of being watched were beginning to take their toll. He had tried to keep his composure, but it was becoming harder and harder to live in peace. But as the days went on, David began to notice something else. His neighbors were starting to look at him differently. They weren't just standing by quietly anymore. People who had kept their distance before were beginning to approach him, offering support in small, subtle ways. David wasn't sure if they were afraid to speak up or if they were just unsure of what to do. But he could feel it. The whispers, the sideways glances, the sudden nods of approval when he passed by. One evening, as he was walking to his car to grab a few tools, he ran into Steve, one of his neighbors who had lived in the area for years. Steve had always been friendly, but they had never really had a deep conversation. Tonight, however, things felt different. "Hey, David," Steve said, his voice quiet. "I've been meaning to talk to you." David looked at him, surprised. "Sure, Steve. What's up?" Steve shifted uncomfortably, looking over his shoulder as if making sure no one was listening. "Look, I don't know if you're aware, but Karen's been telling everyone that you're causing trouble. But people are starting to realize that she's been making things up." David felt a weight lift off his shoulders. "I knew she was exaggerating, but it's good to hear others are seeing through it." Steve nodded. "I've been here long enough to know how Karen works. She's got a reputation for trying to control people, and frankly, she's been pushing too hard lately. We don't like it. Some of us are getting tired of her." David's heart began to race. "So, you believe me?" "I do," Steve said firmly. "And a few others do, too. We're just waiting to see if someone has the guts to stand up to her. We're all afraid of the HOA, but it's clear that Karen's taking things too far." David's jaw tightened. The thought that other people were silently suffering under Karen's control filled him with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't the only one who had been living in fear of the HOA. The whole neighborhood had been under its thumb, and now it was time for that to change. "I'm not going to back down," David said, his voice steady. "I'm fighting this, and I'm going to make sure the HOA knows they can't treat us like this anymore. It's time to stand up." Steve looked at him, a mixture of admiration and uncertainty in his eyes. "You've got some guts, David. If you keep this up, maybe we'll all have a chance to live here without looking over our shoulders." David nodded, feeling the weight of his decision settle deeper within him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been too scared to speak up. The next day, David organized a small meeting with the neighbors who had reached out to him. It wasn't a large group, but it was a start. He wanted to make sure that they were all on the same page and that they could stand together in the face of the HOA's pressure. They met in David's living room, all of them exchanging glances and feeling the same mix of nervousness and excitement. This wasn't just a casual conversation. It was the beginning of something bigger. David knew it, and they all did. "I'm glad you all came," David said, standing in front of the group. "We can't let Karen and the HOA control us anymore. We need to take action, and I think we're all ready for that." There were nods of agreement around the room. Lisa, another neighbor, spoke up. "We've all been afraid of what would happen if we went against the HOA. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that we can't keep living like this. We have to do something." David smiled. "Exactly. If we stand together, we can make a difference. We're not just fighting for our own homes. We're fighting for everyone in this neighborhood who's been pushed around by the HOA." Carl, who had been quiet until then, leaned forward. "But we need evidence. We need something concrete to show that Karen and the HOA are abusing their power." David had already thought about that. "I'm working on it. I've got some documents from the HOA's past actions, and I'm talking to more people who've been affected. If we can prove that they've been using their power unfairly, we'll have a much stronger case." The group began to get excited, realizing that they might actually have a chance to stand up against the HOA. They were no longer alone in this fight. But even as the group began to plan their next steps, David couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. He had taken the first step in standing up to Karen and the HOA, but the battle was far from over. He knew it was going to be a long, difficult fight, but he was ready. He had his neighbors with him now, and together, they were going to make sure their voices were heard. As David left the meeting that night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The neighborhood that had once felt so isolated and controlled was starting to come alive. They were ready to fight back, and David knew that no matter what, he wouldn't let Karen or the HOA win. The next few days were filled with preparation. David had gathered his neighbors, and they were all beginning to stand together. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The HOA's grip on the community had started to loosen, and with each passing day, David could feel the momentum building. But Karen and the HOA weren't going to back down easily. David had known that from the beginning, and now he could see it happening. Late one afternoon, as David was in his yard, preparing for a neighborhood meeting with his supporters, he saw Mrs. Green, the HOA president, walking toward his house. She had a stern expression on her face, and David knew that this was the beginning of another confrontation. "David," Mrs. Green called out, her voice cold. "We need to talk." David took a deep breath and approached her. "What's going on, Mrs. Green?" "We've received multiple complaints about you," Mrs. Green said, her voice stiff with authority. "You're stirring up trouble in this neighborhood, encouraging others to go against the HOA. And now, we're going to have to take action." David's heart sank, but he stood his ground. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm standing up for myself and my neighbors. If the HOA has been abusing its power, I'm going to make sure the community knows about it." Mrs. Green's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. We will not tolerate this behavior. If you continue to disrupt the neighborhood, we'll have no choice but to take legal action against you." David felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his composure. "You can try, but I'm not backing down. I've got support now. And we're going to make sure that the HOA is held accountable for its actions. Mrs. Green scoffed. You think you can win against the HOA? We've been in charge of this neighborhood for years. You'll never win. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving David standing there, more determined than ever. He knew that the fight was only going to get harder from here. The HOA wasn't going to give up without a fight, but David wasn't afraid. He had his neighbors on his side now, and he was ready for whatever they threw at him. Later that evening, David gathered his supporters for a meeting at his house. The group was small but growing, and the energy in the room was electric. They were all fed up with the HOA's control, and now, they were ready to do something about it. We need to take action, David said, standing in front of the group. The HOA thinks they can intimidate us, but we're not going to let them get away with it. We need to expose them. We need to show everyone what they've been doing to this neighborhood. Lisa, one of the more vocal neighbors, nodded in agreement. We can't let them win. We've been living in fear for too long. If we stand together, we can take them down. David looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each person. We need to gather evidence, get more people on board, and make sure the town knows what's really going on. The HOA doesn't have the right to control us, and we're going to make sure they understand that. The room filled with murmurs of agreement. They were ready. The battle was on, and David could feel the strength of their resolve. The day had come. The moment when David and his neighbors would finally confront the HOA in front of the town council. For weeks, they had worked hard to gather evidence, talk to other residents, and prepare their case. They knew the stakes were high, but they were ready to stand up for their homes, their rights, and each other. As David walked into the town hall, he could feel the weight of the situation. The room was filled with people, some of whom had come to show their support, others who had come out of curiosity. Karen and the HOA board members sat at the back, their expressions cold and confident. David couldn't help but notice how smug they looked. They thought they had everything under control, but today, that was about to change. Mrs. Green stood at the podium, her voice steady as she began her speech, trying to defend the HOA's actions. She spoke about maintaining neighborhood standards, about the rules, about how the HOA was working to preserve the community. She tried to make it sound like they were just doing their jobs, but David knew the truth. The HOA wasn't about protecting the neighborhood, they were about controlling it. When it was David's turn to speak, he felt the eyes of the room on him. He had prepared for this moment, but it still felt surreal. He took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. Good evening, everyone, he began, his voice calm but filled with determination. I'm David Matthews, and I've been living in this neighborhood for several months now. When I moved in, I thought I was joining a peaceful, friendly community. But instead, I've been met with accusations, threats, and intimidation from the HOA, specifically, from Karen, a member of the HOA. David paused, letting his words sink in. He could feel the tension in the room. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been afraid to speak up. The HOA has been using its power to control this neighborhood for far too long, David continued. They've fined people for minor issues, they've made false accusations, and they've bullied residents into submission. This isn't about community, it's about power. And I'm here to say that it's time for that to end. There was a murmur in the room. David could see the reactions. Some of the neighbors were nodding in agreement, others were listening intently. Even a few council members were starting to look uncomfortable. David went on, presenting the evidence they had gathered. Testimonies from other residents, records of unfair fines, and examples of the HOA's overreach. He showed the council that this wasn't a simple dispute. It was a pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. Karen, sitting at the back, stood up, her face red with anger. This is absurd, she shouted. David is lying. He's trying to destroy everything we've worked for. But the council wasn't swayed. They had seen the evidence, and they had heard the truth. After a tense silence, one of the council members, a man named Mr. Thompson, stood up. Thank you, Mr. Matthews. We've reviewed the evidence, and it's clear that there have been multiple violations of both the HOA's bylaws and basic community rights. We cannot allow this kind of behavior to continue. The room fell silent as the council deliberated. Karen looked furious, but there was nothing she could do. The truth was out, and the HOA's power had been exposed. Finally, Mr. Thompson spoke again. The council has decided that the HOA will undergo a full review of its practices. Any future actions taken by the HOA will require approval from the town council. And we will be implementing measures to ensure that no more residents are harassed or unfairly fined. David felt a rush of relief. The battle had been long and difficult, but they had won. The HOA's reign of control had come to an end, and the neighborhood could finally breathe again. As the meeting adjourned, David looked around the room at his neighbors. They were all smiling, their faces filled with hope. It had taken courage to stand up to the HOA, but they had done it together. The fight wasn't over, but David knew that the neighborhood had taken its first real step toward freedom.